In the last 2 years, more than 10,000 people with doctorates in science walked out of American government jobs and did not come back. Not fired in a single afternoon. Not one dramatic headline. Just gone. One resignation letter at a time, until the number stopped being a statistic and became a whole. Here's the part that should stop you cold. Nobody in that building noticed the hole until it was already too late to patch it, because the work these people did doesn't show up on any quarterly report. It doesn't build a bridge you can drive over. It doesn't launch a rocket you can watch on television. And that is exactly why it was the first thing anyone cut. I want to tell you about a lizard. A big, slow, venomous lizard called the Gila monster, native to the American Southwest, mostly famous for a bite that ruins your afternoon. For decades, a small number of scientists studied its venom purely because it was strange, because nobody could explain why this particular compound behaved the way it did in a mammal's bloodstream. There was no product, no investor pitch, no quarterly deliverable, just curiosity, funded by grants that a government accountant could have canceled without anyone in the country noticing. That research, done by people nobody has heard of, in labs nobody photographs, eventually led directly to the class of medications now used by millions of people to treat diabetes and obesity. The compound in the lizard's venom mimics a hormone in the human gut. Nobody planned that outcome. Nobody could have. That is the part of science that a spreadsheet cannot capture, and it is the exact part of science that is being quietly dismantled right now. Here is the belief I want to go after, because I think a lot of smart, curious people actually hold it without realizing it. The idea that if research is important, we'll know it's important at the time we fund it. That good science announces itself. That if a project can't explain, in one sentence, why it matters to your life this year, it probably doesn't matter. This feels reasonable. It feels like basic accountability. And it is almost exactly backwards. Here's the mechanism, the actual gear that breaks when you believe that. Fundamental research doesn't fail because it's wasteful. It fails by the standards of a person looking for immediate payoff, because the payoff hasn't been invented yet. In the 1940s and 50s, a physicist named Edward Purcell was studying how atomic nuclei behave when you put them in a strong magnetic field. A question with, as far as anyone could tell, zero commercial application. He won a Nobel Prize for it. It was pure curiosity about atoms. Decades later, other researchers realized that if you can distinguish one atomic nucleus from another this precisely, you can build an image of soft tissue inside a living human body without cutting them open. That is the MRI machine. Every hospital in the developed world now has one. Purcell wasn't building a medical device. He was answering a question about physics that had no obvious use. The use showed up 40 years late, and it showed up enormous. So here's the first open loop, and I want you to sit with it for a minute. If the payoff from real research routinely takes decades to arrive, and politicians are elected on 2 to 4 year cycles, what happens to research the moment a country starts asking, what has this done for me lately? I'll come back to that, because the answer is not what most people assume, and it explains almost everything happening right now. Let's put a number on the bleeding, and I want you to actually do the arithmetic in your head instead of letting it slide past you. Over 10,000 PhD-level scientists left us federal agencies in a single recent year. Not fired all at once. That would have made news for a week and then faded. This was quieter and, frankly, more dangerous. A slow evaporation, lab by lab, grant by grant. Multiply that pattern across NASA's Science Division, the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation. Agencies that don't build rockets or cure diseases directly, but fund the people who do the underlying work that makes rockets flyable and diseases curable in the first place. And you start to see the shape of it. This is not a single cut. It's a slide. And a slide is worse than a cliff, because with a cliff, you know the instant you're falling. I want to pause on that distinction, because it matters more than it sounds like it should. A cliff produces a headline. A slide produces silence. If a government announced tomorrow, in one press conference, that it was closing every space telescope program, canceling every cancer research grant, and sending home every climate scientist, there would be protests within the hour. But that is not how a slide works. and it is not how this one has worked. A slide happens through 100 small, individually defensible decisions. A grant renewal that's 20% smaller, a postdoc position that quietly isn't refilled, a lab that loses one technician and then just operates a little slower, a scientist who gets a better offer from a country that still wants her and nobody notices she's gone until the paper she would have written simply never gets written. Every single decision, taken alone, looks like fiscal prudence. It is only when you stand back and look at 10,000 of those decisions stacked together that you see it for what it actually is. Here's a second story, one I think about often, because it shows the same mechanism from a completely different angle. In the middle of the 20th century, a private research laboratory attached to an American telephone company. Not a university, not a government agency, a phone company. Let a small group of physicists spend years investigating why certain crystals conducted electricity in strange, inconsistent ways. There was no product plan. Nobody in that lab was told to invent anything specific. They were simply allowed to follow a strange material wherever it led. What it led to was the transistor, the single device that made every computer, every phone, every satellite, every piece of modern electronics possible. That laboratory produced multiple Nobel Prizes, not because it was chasing prizes, but because it had built an environment where being confused by something interesting was treated as a legitimate use of a scientist's time. Almost nowhere in the world still funds research that way anymore. Most of that capacity moved into universities and government-funded labs precisely because private industry, quarter after quarter, could not sustain the patience required. Which means when government funding for that kind of open-ended research shrinks, there is no other institution left standing to catch what falls. Here's the second belief I want to dismantle, because it's the one that lets people feel comfortable about the first one. The idea that if American science shrinks, some other country's science simply grows to fill the gap, and the net amount of human progress stays roughly the same. Science is global, so who cares where the lab is, right? Except that's not how expertise moves. Expertise doesn't teleport. It walks. It has a passport. And right now, it is being handed a plane ticket. There are research groups in Germany, in France, in Spain, cold-calling scientists whose American labs just lost their funding, saying, in effect, bring your whole operation here, we'll pay for it. This has already happened, repeatedly, quietly, to people whose names you would recognize if you followed their fields. And it is not new behavior. It is a mirror. For most of the 20th century, the United States was the country making that phone call. Half the graduate students in American physics and chemistry departments for decades were born somewhere else, trained somewhere else, and simply never left because nowhere else could match the infrastructure. That flow just reversed, quietly, without an announcement. And once expertise starts flowing out of a country instead of into it, it does not reverse itself just because you'd like it to. Let me close that second loop properly, because I opened it with a specific claim and I owe you the mechanism behind it, not just the assertion. Why doesn't the flow reverse on its own? Because a laboratory is not a building. It is not equipment you can buy back with a bigger budget next year. A laboratory is a specific group of people who have spent, in some cases, 15 or 20 years learning to work with each other's instincts, who knows which experiments are worth repeating, who catches the mistake in the data before it gets published, who remembers the failed attempt from 6 years ago that explains why this year's approach will also fail the same way. You cannot rebuild that with money alone, because money buys equipment, not accumulated trust between specific human minds. Once that group scatters, one to Munich, one to Barcelona, one to a private company, one into early retirement. The institutional memory does not go into storage. It simply stops existing. The next country gets not just the scientist, but every year of hard-won intuition that scientist is carrying in their head, for free. China is the clearest version of this story, and it's worth walking through slowly because the pattern took 3 full academic generations to complete, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it anywhere else. The first wave of Chinese graduate students who came to the US to study physics and engineering decades ago largely stayed, because at the time there was simply nowhere else with the labs, the funding, the infrastructure to use what they'd learned. The second wave came, trained, and went home, because by then China had started building its own version of that infrastructure and wanted its most capable people back. The third wave. Today's wave. Mostly never leaves China at all, because the infrastructure gap that used to make American training worth crossing an ocean for has largely closed. That is not a hypothetical projection. That is a completed cycle, and it is the exact cycle every country that loses its scientific advantage goes through, right before it notices it's gone. Look at where that completed cycle shows up most visibly today. Semiconductors and artificial intelligence, the two fields everyone agrees will decide economic power for the next 50 years. A meaningful share of the engineers who designed the chips inside the device you're watching this on were trained in programs that depended on exactly the kind of federally funded basic research I've been describing. Materials, science, quantum physics, electrical engineering, all of it seeded decades ago by grants nobody could justify at the time in terms of next quarter's revenue. The country that trains the most people capable of pushing that frontier forward does not just win a research paper. It wins the factories, the supply chains, and the next several decades of who gets to set the rules. That race is not being run in a press conference. It is being run in exactly the kind of unglamorous graduate lab whose funding I just described disappearing. Now here's where I have to be honest with you about something that genuinely unsettles me, because I don't think intellectual honesty means pretending every argument closes cleanly. The uncomfortable part is this. History also contains real, dramatic counterexamples where a country in visible scientific decline snapped back astonishingly fast. And I cannot fully explain why those recoveries worked and why the current slide might not correct itself the same way. In October of 1957, the Soviet Union put a beeping metal sphere into orbit, and the United States, which had been comfortably ahead in nearly every measurable way, was so rattled that within a single year it created NASA from nothing, and within 12 years put 2 human beings on the surface of the moon. After Pearl Harbor, American scientists isolated the element plutonium in 1940 and had a working atomic weapon tested in the New Mexico desert 5 years later. A timeline that would be almost unthinkable for a comparable engineering project today. Both of those recoveries required something the current moment simply does not have yet. A single, undeniable, universally agreed upon shock everyone could see and feel at the same time. Sputnik was visible. Pearl Harbor was visible. A slide in NAH grant renewals is not visible. I don't know, honestly, whether a threat that never announces itself with one dramatic morning can produce the same mobilization that a missile overhead or a burning harbor did. That is not a rhetorical question I'm asking for effect. I genuinely don't have the answer, and I think pretending otherwise would be dishonest. I want to sit inside that discomfort a little longer, because it's tempting to rush past it towards something more hopeful, and I don't think that would be fair to you. Every recovery I just described came after the damage was already visible to everyone at once. Nobody had to convince the public that Sputnik was real. Nobody had to explain in a 10-minute video why plutonium mattered. The problem announced itself, and the solution followed naturally from national panic. What happens when the loss is real and severe and measurable in exactly the way I've been describing to you for the last several minutes, but it never produces that single unifying morning? What happens if the response to a slide is always, permanently, another round of the same small, individually defensible decisions that caused it in the first place? I don't have a satisfying answer. I have a suspicion, and the suspicion is this. It's possible for a great scientific nation to end, not with a moment anyone remembers, but with a decade nobody was watching closely enough to grieve. Let's close the loop I opened earlier about what happens to research the moment a country starts demanding immediate payoff. Here is the answer, and it is not comforting. The research doesn't stop existing. It stops existing here. The questions don't go unanswered. They go answered somewhere else, by someone else, on someone else's terms, on someone else's patents, in someone else's language. Nature does not require your permission to keep making discoveries. It only requires that somebody, somewhere, keeps asking the right questions with the right instruments. If that somebody stops being you, the discoveries still happen. You just stop being in the room when they do. Consider what that actually costs a country, beyond pride. The nation that funds the discovery usually also owns the first patents, trains the first generation of engineers who know how to apply it, builds the first companies around it, and captures the first and largest share of the economic value it eventually creates. This is not an abstract or symbolic loss. It has a currency and a head count. Every major technology sector that exists today, computing, telecommunications, modern medicine, satellite navigation, began as unglamorous, slow, curiosity-driven research that took decades to become a product anyone could buy. The country that hosted that early research overwhelmingly ended up hosting the industry that grew out of it. Lose the research phase, and you don't just lose a line item in a science budget. You lose the industries that don't exist yet, the ones nobody has named, the ones that will define the next 50 years of who has power and who does not. And this is where the size of the question changes on you, because everything I've described so far, funding lines, PhD counts, lab evacuations, is actually the small version of something much bigger. Every civilization that has ever mattered on a long enough timescale has been, underneath its politics and its wars and its economies, a bet on which questions were worth asking before anyone could prove they were worth asking. The printing press wasn't funded because someone proved it would end feudalism. The steam engine wasn't built because an accountant approved the return on investment for the Industrial Revolution. Nuclear magnetic resonance wasn't studied because someone foresaw the MRI. In every case, the civilization that kept a standing army of people allowed to ask expensive, useless-sounding questions is the civilization that ended up owning the future nobody could see coming. And the civilization that decided curiosity had to justify itself in advance, every single time in recorded history, is the one you read about in the past tense. I keep coming back to one image, because it's the one that actually keeps me up at night more than any of the numbers do. Somewhere right now, there is a graduate student, brilliant, 26 years old, sitting in a lab that is one budget cycle away from losing its funding, working on a question so narrow and so strange that if you described it to a room of 100 people, 99 of them would ask why anyone should pay for it. That student has no way of knowing whether her question is this generation's version of Purcell's atoms in a magnetic field, 40 years from a use nobody has imagined yet, or simply a dead end. Neither does she. Neither do I. Neither does anyone. That not knowing is not a flaw in the system. It is the entire point of the system. A country that only funds the questions it can already predict the answer to has quietly redefined science as something that has already happened, rather than something that is still, stubbornly, gloriously, unfinished. So let's go back, one final time, to the belief I've been taking apart from 5 different angles across everything I've just told you. That good science announces its usefulness up front, and if it can't, it probably isn't worth the money. I want you to notice what that belief actually is, underneath the reasonable-sounding packaging. It is not a budgeting philosophy. It is not fiscal responsibility. It is a confession that a society has stopped being able to tell the difference between not understanding something yet and that thing being worthless, and has decided to treat its own ignorance as proof rather than as the entire reason science exists in the first place. A nation that can only fund what it already understands has, without quite noticing, given up on the future in favor of an extended, well-managed present. And a present that refuses to fund its own future doesn't get a warning. It gets a phone call from Germany or from Shanghai, asking, politely, if you'd like to bring your whole operation with you.